This is a wonderful day for us that's been in preparation for a long time. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our members and our staff, and of course the sponsors for Bearden Picasso, Rhythms and Reverberations, and Picasso Landscapes Out of Bounds, we want to welcome you to the Mint Museum. This is the 50th anniversary of Pablo Picasso's death in 1973. And the 35th year of Romare Bearden's passing in 1988. And with this, the Mint realized that we could acknowledge both of these renowned artists with two stellar, one-of-a-kind exhibitions that is only being premiered here on the East Coast, and that being Picasso Landscapes and Bearden Picasso. And for Picasso Landscapes, you can also see it in Cincinnati once it closes here the end of May. So the exhibitions have been open for just over a month. And I am happy to say we've sold out every weekend. During the week, we've had amazing attendance during the week. And we are especially proud of the support that we receive from both the City of Charlotte and the County of Mecklenburg for their support for both of these exhibitions that have allowed us to form a partnership with CMS schools that allow school groups to come to tour both of these exhibitions on days that we have set aside specifically for school groups, so that they can feel at ease to speak a little bit more loudly than maybe they would at visiting a museum, and to be able to demonstrate the kind of excitement that we feel these exhibitions and this artwork can instill in them. And all of those slots for those tours are full. We sold those out almost probably the day we opened the show. Those were sold out. And so that we could capture the youth that would maybe not be captured by the CMS tours. The funding of the county and the city also allowed us to have these exhibitions free for any child K through 12. And one more thing, which I almost forgot, which is so exciting, is that for the kids who come through the CMS school tours, we give them a family pass for them to take home, which is a free return visit for them and their family free of charge. And we have seen a lot of those tickets come back, so we're glad that the kids have been so inspired by what they see that they want to bring their parents back. So I've mentioned the city and the county and our other presenting sponsors, and you'll see a full list of the sponsors upstairs when you go into the exhibition, include not only the city and the county, but also Bank of America, Duke Energy, Anna Michael Tarwater, and M.A. Rogers. And let me just say to all of you in the audience, when we were putting this together, you have to remember we were closed for COVID. And so the prospect of doing what would be the largest exhibition and the most expensive exhibition this institution has done in decades, at a time when the stock market was tanking and people were laying off employees, and PPP loans had not come online yet, or ERTC had not come online yet, and we didn't know when we were going to come back, and we didn't know what masks meant, and we didn't know what boosters were. We decided that we would take on this project, and we had those individuals and corporations that I just mentioned step up to the plate early to say, this is what Charlotte needs, this is what the Mint needs, and we want to do this for the community. So I want to thank them and all the other names that you're going to see on the list upstairs for their faith in this institution and in the community and what art can mean as art and museums as a venue for healing. So we have a number of partners that as part of these exhibitions. We tried to partner with almost all of the cultural institutions in this region, including the Beckler across the street. Am I pointing in the right way? I'm terrible at directions. At the Beckler and the Gant, now I'm just arbitrarily pointing, and Jazz Arts, and you're going to hear from Jazz Arts after this presentation, and a number of other institutions like the Opera and the Symphony, and many, many others who helped make this pair of exhibitions more of a community event than just a Mint Museum event, and so we're thankful to them. Now for the program today. So the Mint is bringing to you two of the most esteemed and well-respected scholars globally on the topic of Romare Bearden. We have with us Doctors Denise Murrell and Richard Powell, right in front. And they will be introduced to you momentarily by our Senior Curator of American Art, Jonathan Stuhlman. So as you know, many of you know, Rick Powell is at Duke University, so not far from here. And Denise Murrell, which you might not know, is originally from Gastonia? Grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina. So this is a bit of a homecoming for both. And Denise Murrell is now a curator-at-large at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So please, well, let me ask, how many of you have seen Bearden Picasso, Rhythms and Reverberations? Oh, look at all those gold stars. Okay, so those of you who have not seen it yet, please see it multiple times, and because, like me, all of your brackets are busted now anyway, so there's no point in watching March Madness anymore, so you can go and see that exhibition as much as you want. I mean, who would have guessed Fairleigh Dickinson? I didn't. Okay, so our guests today are here to talk to you about Romare Bearden. And after this event, we invite you to go into the atrium for a jazz performance with vocalist Dawn Anthony and the Lavelle Bradford Trio. As you know, Romare Bearden also wrote music. Some of you may know that, some of you may not know that, and had some hit songs. And so Romare Bearden and Pablo Picasso both saw music, and in particular jazz, as an integral part of their creative process. Speaking of jazz, I'm good. Well, let me ask. Am I allowed to make this announcement? Is it final? Yes. A voice from beyond. Okay, yes. So the ink has dried, so I can now say that on May the 14th, we have a special program at the that is a collaboration between the Mint Museum, Jazz Arts, Charlotte, which will be next door at the Night Theater, which is a performance by Branford Marsalis. So as some of you may know, Branford Marsalis produced a CD probably 20 years ago from Bearden Revealed, which addresses and where he performed some of Bearden's music. And it's been 20 years or so since that CD premiered, and this will be the first time since then that he will be playing that music again. So your tickets are available today. So today, live, go to the Blumenthal box office website, and you can get your tickets there. Okay, so that's it for me. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Stuhlman, who's going to introduce our guests today. And, am I? Ruby? Okay, so those of you who, I take all of that back. Those of you who don't know Ruby Bridheit, she is in many ways the lifeblood of this institution and a glue that we couldn't do without. Her energy and her knowledge and her compassion is infectious. So I want to give her the podium for an important reading.
if you all noticed, he lowered the podium when he was at Con. 5'1". Thank you all for coming today. We are so honored to have you, and we're honored to be able to share with you that the Mint Museum has what is being traditionally done in the museum world now and throughout, an actual land acknowledgement. And so I want to briefly share with you the short version of what we have, but you'll soon see on our website how we are acknowledging and show respect to those that I'll mention here. I would like to start this meeting by acknowledging the original and rightful custodians of the land, the Catawba, the Chirraw, Sugary, Wateree, and Waxhaw peoples. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the enslavement of African people and their descendants that built the original U.S. Mint building at Randolph, which is a federal building. Thank you. We're glad to be able to share this with you, and we will continue to proceed to share this as we open our public programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Ruby. It's great to be here. Before this program, I was walking around the museum and just couldn't stop smiling. And it's been that way since Picasso and Bearden Picasso opened. Having been at this museum a long time, as many of you know, I've never seen it this buzzing, never seen programs so well attended, I've never seen this many people in the galleries, learning, enjoying, and not just those two exhibitions, our permanent collection galleries as well. And I think, you go into the curatorial field because you love art, and I love doing research, and I love sitting in my office and reading books and writing things, but you also do it because you want what you do to be shared with others, and to see that really, really happening, it's wonderful. So after this program, if you go up in the galleries, just look around, and it's really a heartwarming sight. So I'm going to be brief and then get out of the way for the main event. But we wanted to take a moment and many of you know about Bearden's long connection with the Mint Museum. Some of you may not. But I just wanted to go over that a little bit and talk a little bit about how Bearden Picasso came to be. This incredible collage, which is, you have to go upstairs and see it because it's not being done justice on the screen, came into the Mint's collection in 1975, the year after it was made. Now other museums, Bearden was up in New York working, and other museums in the North had acquired his work prior to that. I think it's a pretty key thing for a museum in this region, in the South, and of course in his home state and home city, to have acquired that piece at that point in history. And so that kind of kicked things off. In 1980, the Mint organized a 10-year survey of Bearden's recent work, and I've dug into our archives, and that shows the amount of research and planning that went into that project. I mean, there are boxes and boxes full of files for that. So to me, that signals that the Mint was putting a lot of effort and resources and time into doing this. And that really began a number of Bearden exhibitions, and the Mint really starting to build its collection of works by Bearden. We have the most of any public institution. So that exhibition happened in 1980. In 2002, we did a show called Romare Bearden, Charlotte's Own. And then in 2011, Romare Bearden Southern Recollections. And those, they really built on each other. We did other smaller projects with Bearden along the way. But I wanted just to take a moment to acknowledge the people who put those shows together. On the left, Gerald Melberg. And he's here with us. Raise your hand, Gerald. And I haven't seen her. Carla Hansel, are you here? Yes. Where? Raise your hand. She's coming. She was on her, well, when you see her later, there she is. Please thank both of them for all that they have done to really carry on the passion for Bearden here at the Mint. In this building, when we opened it, I think one of the amazing things was that we carved out a gallery dedicated to works by Romare Bearden, to rotations from our collection, exploring different aspects of his work, different artists that he impacted, sometimes picking a theme and relating it to other works in our collection. So the Romare Bearden Gallery. That is upstairs. It's right in the heart when you walk through our permanent collection of American and modern and contemporary art. Find it right smack dab in the middle. And I've been managing those galleries for the past couple of years, and it's really been a joy to get to know our collection better, to get to know Bearden's work better, and to share that with people. So this is one of our more recent installations in there. So how do we get to Bearden, Picasso, Rhythms, and Reverberations? As Todd mentioned, we started considering the Picasso show at an interesting moment, and it took a little while to work out that contract and get us fully on board. But as we did, we started to think, so we're doing this, and we're going to be bringing many, many people from Charlotte who haven't been to the Mint before to the Mint, and many people from up and down the East Coast and overseas to Charlotte, as we are the first venue and the only East Coast venue for that Picasso show. So how can we highlight Bearden for all of these people who are coming here, who might not know that Bearden spent the first few years of his life 4 blocks from where we're sitting right now, who might not know about all of the connections that his later work had to Charlotte. Full credit to Todd. Todd said to me, well, didn't Bearden and Picasso meet? Can't we do something to connect the two of them? And if you look in the literature, there has been writing on the connections between the two. But there's never been an exhibition that explored that connection. And so we started rather quickly putting together a show. We came up with the foundation for the show. And instead of having it back in our Bearden Gallery, which, as I said, people are in the permanent collection galleries, but we really wanted to foreground it. And so if you go to see Picasso landscapes, you can't not see Bearden and Picasso Rhythms and Reverberations. We built it right into the flow of the exhibition. And so we've gotten really tremendous feedback from the exhibition. People really thrilled to not only see Bearden highlighted. One of the most exciting things for me was that we were able to bring in a lot of Bearden's works from the 40s, which you don't see that often, and people don't think of. If they think of Bearden, they tend to think of those wonderful collages from the 70s and 80s, photostat pieces, but many different aspects of Bearden's career kind of continually being re-explored, re-examined. So to see those early paintings of his from the 40s, it's really eye-opening. And to be able to bring a number of them together was really great. So very happy to have this here. And now, before we get to Rick and Denise, wanted to turn it over to Diedra Harris-Kelly, who is one of the current co-directors of the as we were talking with them about the programming that we were planning for on the exhibition, we started talking about doing some sort of Scholars Day. And so I really want to credit them with bringing in our 2 speakers today, and not only Diedra Harris-Kelly, who's going to take the podium in a moment, but also Joanne Bryant-Reed, who's right there. And also, I love the fact that they brought, thank you. The fact that they decided to bring their board of directors down to have their meeting here in Charlotte this weekend. We're thrilled to have many of the board of directors members with us here as well. So Diedra Harris-Kelly is going to tell you a little bit about the foundation, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about her first. She is currently one of the co-directors of the Romare Bearden Foundation, the nonprofit organization perpetuating the legacy of Romare Bearden. Sorry. She offers a unique perspective on Bearden's work, being a formerly trained painter, and niece of the artist's late wife, Nanette Rohan Bearden. Diedra develops and runs programming and acts as the foundation's chief curator and researcher. And I'll tell you, I spent the whole day yesterday with she and Joanne and Sheila on the board of directors in storage, and I learned so much about our own collection by looking at Bearden's work with them. For the last 16 years, she's been part of the team leading a successful run of exhibitions, publications, educational, and celebratory programs around the life and art of Romare Bearden. Harris-Kelly earned an MFA from the University of Michigan and currently teaches a seminar course on Bearden at Barnard College. She's taught studio art at New York University, Parsons School of Design Studio Program, and for alternative high school and elementary school programs, as well as conducting professional development workshops and lectures on art. She was a member of the curatorial team of Jazz at Lincoln Center from 2009 to 2012, and is the author of Revisiting Romare Bearden's Art of Improvisation, published in Uptown Conversation, The New Jazz Studies by Columbia University. Harris-Kelly's own artwork has been published in books and journals, and most recently shown in a solo exhibition at the Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art in Staten Island. Diedra, it's wonderful to have you here, and please come on up.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a little understatement. I just want to thank him again. We did take up so much of his time, and not only that, we descended upon the Mint Museum with members of the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, who is publishing the catalog raisonné, a digital catalog raisonné that will be offered to the public for free when we get it done. But I just want to, shout them out. They're here. They're going to be mingling upon and in the midst of you. So if you have any questions, Kamara Holloway is the project director, and you just tag her down and ask her all about it. But poor Jonathan, we've just been, tugging at him, making him pull all those works out. Because, why? Because you have the most Beardens here, so that's why we're here, right? And so that was lovely. But I just want to say a thank you to Cynthia Moreno. I mean, when we were working on this project and really trying to figure out how we can impose ourselves, because this is what we do with the Bearden Foundation. We get involved with all celebrations, everything that's going on about Bearden, and our relationship with the Mint goes way, way back. Ruby, our cheerleader here, she is wonderful, wonderful. Director of Community Relations. Yes, give another shout out to her. Because we've been coming back and forth to the Mint maybe for 15 years. I think she reminded me 15 years, beginning with the preparations for the Southern Recollection show, which was a blowout, wonderful. And again, we descend, because when we come with a lot of people. As you will see, we have many of our board members here. So on behalf of the board of directors and staff, and that's Joanne Bryant-Reed, my co-director. We are co-directors, but also we have with us today one of our brand new leaders, an executive director, Linda Steele. So Linda, raise your hand. And why don't we just get all the board members just to quickly get out their seats so that people can see who you are, so they can tug at your sleeves, okay? And I have to give a shout out to our great galleryist from DC Moore Gallery, Bridget Moore is here with us today too. Thank you. Good, that's good. But so our relationship with the Mint Museum goes back, and Ruby was so instrumental with the Bearden Society, which was an organization, much like they have at several museums, where you have an organization that's purpose is to really focus on maybe one aspect of collecting that doesn't get done or can't get done on a larger scale. And so they were very instrumental, I believe, in bringing several Bearden works here, purchasing several Bearden works. But when we came and we were when they were preparing for the Southern Recollections, we made lots of friends while we were here. So I got to give a shout out to Patrick Diamond. I know he's here. And Patrick, these are folks that we came and we met, and they became our friends, and we keep up with them. And Patrick even keeps sending me clippings of stuff that happens here, so that I appreciate that. So he hips me to that, and I want to also talk about the park. I'm just going to say thank yous because we want to get to the special event. But I will have to give a shout out to Lee Jones. I hope he's here. I don't see him, okay. But Lee Jones from the Parks Department, when they said they wanted to build up City Park and name it after Romare Bearden, okay, so for any of you who don't know, there's a Bearden Park out here. Beautiful park, and they reached out to us, and we were able to come and talk to them about what was going to be featured in the park and what we wanted them to do. I know, Gerald was a part of that. We were saying, well, where's the art? And maybe we could have like a facsimile of the block, or, those kinds of ideas. And they just produced something really beautiful that's very much used for protest, for demonstrations, for weddings, for graduation. So then we came back when they had the installation of the sculpture by Richard Hunt, which is beautiful out there. And so these are the kinds of visits we've had, and we've loved coming back and forth. But I must remind you that the relationship with the Mint and Charlotte, of course, goes all the way back to Romare Bearden being born here in 1911. And then that very epic, iconic exhibition in 1980 here at the Mint, curated by Gerald Melberg, who's over there. He's not smiling, but take some credit for that. That was a very instrumental show. And of course, Romare was making lots of friends. We have Herb Jackson, I don't know if he's in the house, a good friend of Bearden's, and Davison College, where there was a Romare Bearden Scholarship. We have some Davison College folks here? Okay, all right, yeah. So I just have to thank those folks and everyone else who along the way has just welcomed us. Carla Hansel, really would love to see her again. So, okay, too many thank yous, but of course also Todd, I guess you sat down, Todd Herman, Cynthia, Ruby, and a little bit about the foundation. I know most of you know who we are. We're 501c3, and we have just begun to really dig into a catalog raisonné, which is the ultimate catalog of an artist. And so we are working with the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, but they are taking all of our materials that we've been collecting for over 33 years now, that the foundation was founded by Romare Bearden's widow, Nanette Bearden, who was my aunt. And there's a special shout out to one of Nanette's youngest sisters, Sheila Rohan, who's on the board. Because keeping the thing going takes a lot of people. It takes a lot of love, just love and dedication. All right, so I think I ran on a little bit too much, but I do want to get to the introductions of our special guest for today, because this is such an honor to have, they're my friends, I know these people, but it is a particular honor to have an opportunity to bring them in and to have such a good match for what we want to expand on with Bearden. So you'll see Bearden and Picasso, of course, the influence, Jonathan's wonderful show, but it does take a lot of understanding to really see what Bearden was doing and what he was thinking about, and other artists of his contemporaries. And so that's what I hope we will get to today. All right, so Richard J. Powell, is the John Spencer Bassett Distinguished Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. You heard that, he's been there since 1990. After completing his undergraduate studies at Morehouse College and earning an MFA in printmaking from Howard University, Powell received the MA in African American Studies and the MPhil and PhD in the History of Art from Yale University. I'm going to break out here just a second and say that Rick is one of our distinguished advisors, and so he is on our board of advisors. And in 2006, he produced a beautiful exhibition at the Nasher Museum of Art, and we came down for a Bearden symposium. And that exhibition, Conjuring Bearden, Conjuring Bearden was the title. But the wonderful thing that Rick did was he really used some of his students to work on that and to work on the beautiful catalog. So I just want to remember to say that because I didn't write it down. Powell is a recognized authority on African American art and culture and has organized numerous art exhibitions, most notably the Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture and Modernism in 1989, Rhapsodies in Black, Art of the Harlem Renaissance, put my glasses on, To Conserve a Legacy, American Art at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, very important show, 1999. Back to Black, Art Cinema and the Racial Imagination in 2005, and Archibald Motley, which was a fabulous exhibition, Jazz Age Modernist in 2014. Among the museums where his exhibitions have been presented are the Art Institute of Chicago, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, London's Whitechapel Art Gallery, the Whitney Museum of Art, of American Art. Along with teaching, Rick has written extensively on topics ranging from primitivism to postmodernism, including such titles as Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, that was in 1991, Black Art, seminal to teaching art, history, cultural history, originally published in 1997, but has had several reprintings, and the newest volume was 2021. Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, 2008, and Going There, Black Visual Satire, 2020. From 2007 until 2010, Powell was editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, the world's leading English language journal in art history. Now, I cut this down some, so you know he got a lot. But Powell has received awards and honors as Distinguished Scholar, and in 2018, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 2006, like I said, he did that, that great show on Conjuring Bearden. So I'm gonna also then go on to Denise, but I would like him to have a little applause just for his distinguished scholarship. All right. Denise Murrell is the Merrill H. and James S. Tisch Curator-at-Large, Office of the Director at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was a curator of the groundbreaking exhibition Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet and Matisse to Today. That was in 2018 at Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery. I had to just say that again because I love that title. And they had a big, beautiful Bearden in that one, but she'll talk about that. And she was a co-curator of the exhibition's expansion at the Musée d'Orsay, okay, in Paris, and a guest lecturer for its final tour at the Memorial Act Pointe-à-Pitre, Guadeloupe Museum of Slavery. And that museum is so interesting. I went online to look at it, but it won European Museum of the Year in 2017. I thought that was great. Dr. Murrell has taught art history at Columbia University in New York and in Paris. She has published and lectured extensively on 19th and 20th century modernism and global contemporary art. In December 2022, Dr. Murrell was inducted at, I think it's a version of the Arts and Letters in France. Okay, I'm not going to try to use my French to say it. She is currently planning a major exhibition on the Harlem Renaissance and transatlantic modernism that will situate this African-American-led movement within the multinational context of early 20th century modernism. And you know where that's going to be? The Met. She is also developing a series of collection-based installations in the European painting galleries and initiating relevant acquisitions from the 19th century to the present. Her research in museums moves across the departments of European paintings and modern and contemporary art, while also engaging with the collections in the American wing, European sculpture and decorative arts, and the Department of Photographs. Murrell is the author of the catalog, Posing Modernity, from Yale University Press, and the catalog received the College Art Association Book Award. The College Art Association and Daedalus Foundation Book Awards, so that's 2. And just some recent publications, Susan Valadon's Venus Noire, A Conversation, and Bazel's Degas and Modern Black Paris in the Wiley Blackwell Companion to Impressionism, okay? And The Mirror of History, Black Artists as Anti-Racist Activists. This is wonderful. So this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Bulletin, correct, 2020. Murrell, Dr. Murrell, previously received an MBA. Okay, I don't know if I can say this wasn't part of your official bio, but she had a previous life. She got an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BS from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So she's had a whole other career in finance and consulting. Too bad for them, because we have her now. So without further ado, and any more words from me, let's give her a hand, yes. Okay, I say all of that, so now Dr. Powell will go first, and then immediately after that, don't get out of your seats, because then Dr. Murrell will get up. So now you've heard both of their bios, so without further ado, hit it.
I have to start off, but since so many people, so many entities, so many institutions, so many efforts and initiatives have gone into making today possible, I thank all of those folks. But I also want to thank Romare Bearden. And I'm thinking about when I first met him. I was a student at Morehouse College, and he came to Spelman, where I was taking an art class. And I remember being bowled over by this person who looked like Yul Brynner, but just bigger. And he was so suave and articulate, and just pulled ideas out of his head about art and culture. I mean, I was just blown away. And then I thought about perhaps the last conversation I had with him, which was in 1984, right before I did a Fulbright in Copenhagen. And I called him to talk about an artist, William H. Johnson. And that was a phone conversation from afar. But I'm just thinking about that arc of my engagements with him and what his legacy has produced. So he is in the house, and I have to give major thanks to Romare Bearden for bringing us together, for making this show possible, and for really creating a movement in art and art history. I want to move quickly into a quote. And this quote is from Wolfgang Paulin, who was from Vienna, Austria. He at one point was a surrealist, but after a while he got kind of fed up with André Breton and that whole crowd, and then he moved to Mexico, which is what happens in the mid-20th century. Mexico is the place where intellectuals and art and energy is happening, and he settles there, and he engages with writing and also moving between Mexico City and New York City. But in 1945, he writes this book, Form and Sense, Problems of Contemporary Art. And this quote has just been with me for the longest, and it's really appropriate for me to begin my conversation with you today. But it was not, first of all, of Bach that I thought in front of the luminous scaffoldings that Picasso and Braque built between 1909 and 1912. First of all, I was overwhelmed by an almost ritual power of incantation, by a syncopated rhythm which irresistibly evoked jazz. For an analogy with the syncopation of Negro music, instead of going farther away in perspective. In these pictures, in fans, and innumerable facets of plastic paraphrases, there advances toward the spectator a sort of counter space. As I told Diedra, what I wanted to do today was frame Romare Bearden and frame Pablo Picasso in a larger question around Cubism. And not just Cubism in the United States, but Cubism and African American art. And I thought I would start with Aaron Douglas, who arrives in New York in 1925 from the Midwest. Earnest, wide-eyed. I'm thinking about Stevie Wonder's, Living for the City. You get off the subway and you look up and you say, New York. This big city, skyscrapers. And what Aaron Douglas fortuitously experiences upon those initial days in New York are figures like Charles Johnson, who was the head of the Urban League, and Alain Locke, who was kind of the godfather, if you will, of the Harlem Renaissance. But the real connection that I think was really important for him was another German-speaking figure, not Wolfgang Paulin, but Winold Reiss, who was a product of the modern movements in Europe before he comes to New York to be a major graphic designer. Anyway, I'm showing you here two pictures, one from 1925 and one from 1926. These are early in Aaron Douglas's moment in New York City. And they're the covers of publications, two important publications. I'll never forget a good friend of mine at Yale, we were talking about the Harlem Renaissance. He says, what does it mean that two of the great publications of the Harlem Renaissance, one is called Opportunity and the other is called Crisis? So in other words, I don't think this was thought out, but it's clear that in this glorious moment, there's this delightful tension between the possibilities and the struggle, always being in tandem with one another. And fortunately for young artists like Aaron Douglas, he has an opportunity to contribute to both of those publications. And I'm showing you two, and I wanted to show you these two because going back to Wolfgang Paulin's idea of advancing forward, of not being bound by perspective, by literally within a number of months of Aaron Douglas arriving in New York, he had figured out these rules that could be reimagined and rethought. Perhaps through the lens of Pablo Picasso and Braque and other modernists who are beginning to show in New York during that time, mostly through Alfred Stieglitz, also through Neumann Gallery, J.B. Neumann, this very important gallerist who was showing not just French artists, but German artists, and not just French and German artists, but African-American artists. But I'm showing you these two covers, one December 1925 and one November 1926. And you see why I'm doing this. Because in 25, Aaron Douglas gives us this portrait, this profile, this iconic image of this black man, but he's inserted these reverberations, these rhythms, these vibrations. They're built into the head itself, so that when we see this man, when we see the horizon, the star hovering over the landscape behind him, there's energy there that vibrates, even in simple black and white. And then, a year later, he does another cover for The Crisis, and he decides to go naturalistic. But it's not just straight-ahead naturalism. He has incorporated these cubistic messages, these cubistic vehicles for fracturing this face and turning it from something that is round and smooth to something that is faceted, that has depth and spatial dimensions connected to it. That's 25 and 26. But we could also really reach out beyond art and art makers. And I think this is really also where Wolfgang Paulin is perhaps thinking when he talks about not just Negro jazz, but he's really thinking about Black lives and Black bodies and Black energies and Black designs and Black fashion and Black corporeality. And so in the course of my research, I come across this, this clip from the Chicago Defender, 1927, strutting his onions, Boise Johnson of Georgia. It's hard to see, and it's hard to kind of get your hands on those old newspapers, but you can kind of make out this brother really comes up with some interesting fashion statements. this little tiny cape on his back, this fedora that seems to take up his entire head, these huge lapels on his suit, these bell-bottom pants which seem to fly up and down the Champs-Élysées, this cane that has rocks and jewelry and stuff attached to it. I mean, to me, this is Cubism in motion. Picasso could not have imagined that. This is Boise Johnson of Georgia, you know, enacting and performing Cubism. And of course, the other person who's performing Cubism is the indomitable Josephine Baker. And she becomes this icon from East St. Louis, that girl on the end of the showbiz chorus line who's always making faces and joking, and finally gets a chance to be the star. We know that Hollywood story, but this is a story that Hollywood won't tell you. That this beautiful 18-year-old African-American woman goes to France and turns the city upside down. Really blows everybody away, including Picasso, including Alfred Luce, the architect, including the great illustrator Paul Colin. I mean, she really forces artists to reimagine what they had thought they had figured out through Cubism. And she does that with her own body. Not just the dancing. We've seen those incredible films from French films, because the Americans would never do films of this incredible, beautiful woman. The French, we can give credit for acknowledging her beauty and her power and her artistry. But even in her style, I'm back to this style thing again. She actually acquires a kind of a company in Paris called Baker Fix, and it incorporates this pomade. And she uses that pomade on her hair to kind of create patterns and zigzags and smooth designs that move and twirl on her head. And then the light on it creates another kind of energy. Again, sculpture, Black bodies in motion. And I'm also showing you these two film stills from Dudley Murphy, really important American filmmaker. He had hung out with Ferdinand Léger and worked on a very important film called Ballet Mécanique. But after that, he comes back to the United States and settles in New York, and he has to deal with what's going on, this thing called the Harlem Renaissance, this thing called the New Negro. And he makes a couple of films. Some of you might be familiar with the famous one, St. Louis Blues with Bessie Smith. But there's this other one that he does called Black and Tan Fantasy, where he actually uses the camera to kind of fracture and to create a kind of a jagged pattern and motifs where bodies are repeated and replicated and are responding to one another. He uses the camera on a dancer so that she's upside down and right side up. He is really trying to do his thing with this idea of reimagining the Black body. Thanks to Dr. Murrell's incredible project that's going to launch in a year or two, this major exhibit on the Harlem Renaissance, I give her all praises for encouraging me to rethink and relook at carefully and critically Hale Woodruff's so important painting, The Card Players. Yes, of course, Paul Cézanne had dealt with that theme many years earlier. But I mean, if you put these two together, I mean, it's clear that Hale Woodruff has taken this into another zone. That he has taken this theme of these card players in the stratosphere almost, where the table has been turned up, where the chairs have been turned around, where the interior has been flipped up, where these colors and the table red, the shoulders green, the other tables orange, these bodies yellow. He has really done a job, if you will, on this idea. And I would argue that this job that he's done on this theme is informed by him growing up in Indianapolis, Indiana, and hanging out with the jazz musicians and gamblers, and then being in Paris with a whole coterie of fellow black artists and intellectuals who are playing poker with each other. Lois. I mean, I was so lucky to have gone to Howard in the 1970s and to have had engagements with Lois Mailou Jones, a little lady who, despite her height, was extraordinary, was powerful, was majestic, and had a long, long story of engagement with art and ideas. I'm showing you on the left her cover of Opportunity magazine, done in 1928. I'm showing you a painting on the right that was done a few years later, 1935, basically inspired by that 1928 image. And I'm showing you in the middle Nelson Rockefeller and board members of the Museum of Modern Art drooling over Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, you know. And I would propose to you that, yes, Demoiselles d'Avignon was an important, incredible, significant work of art. But in the mind of a Lois Mailou Jones, who is trying to make sense of this new Negro thing, this new experience, this new opportunity to think about blackness in a new way, in a jazz-inflected, in a blues aesthetic-inflected way, she has kind of taken lessons from Picasso and Cubism, and again, taken it into the other zone, into another zone. And so she gives us these images of these profiled figures, these imagined folks from the continent. And she has literally pulled them. She has stretched them. She has elongated them. So when one hears Louis Armstrong during the same time period, you know, on his trumpet blowing and reverberating, or when we see Josephine Baker do one of those splits, you know, on the stage, you know, in Paris, and then we look at these pieces by Lois Mailou Jones as how she has really kind of forced us to kind of not do something representational and naturalistic and perspectival, but something that's imaginative, something that pushes what the possibilities of the figure and representationalism can be in service to reimagining blackness. There's this painting that was done in the mid-30s that I don't know about Denise and Diedra, but it has always blown me away. And it's called The Yellow Hat. And it's by Norman Lewis, who was a protege of Romare Bearden's, a protege of Jake Lawrence's. He also studied with Augusta Savage. His background was Caribbean. I think his family was Trinidad and Tobago. He's living in New York in the depths of the Great Depression. And he is very much his own artist. And he creates this image of this woman. And it's disarming in its simplicity. But it is clear that Norman Lewis has really picked up on just the kind of elements that Cubism kind of presents to us as a way to think about figuration, to think about the body. But unlike a lot of Cubism, I would argue, looking, for example, next door at The Dream from 1932, a few years before his Woman with Yellow Hat, what Norman Lewis is able to do is to inject in this fracture, to inject in this abstraction emotion, to give this woman and her pose and her gesture a message that speaks to the lives and the struggles and the dreams and the hopes and the aspirations of black women in the depths of the Great Depression, in the depths of economic despair and struggle. And so, I mean, wow, how can an artist take modernism and make modernism be something that speaks to people's lives and people's hearts and souls. And so this painting, again, it's a haunting painting, and it comes back to us over and over and over again with its cubism inflections. And today is William H. Johnson's birthday. He was born March 18, 1901. And we're next door to South Carolina, and there was no way I could do what I'm doing today without doing a shout out to this remarkable young man from Florence, South Carolina, who leaves South Carolina and moves to New York in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, he's in Paris, and by the 1930s, he's in Scandinavia, and by the mid-1930s, he's in Tunisia, and by the late 1930s, he's back in New York, and he encounters black culture, the jitterbuggers, the zoot suits, and does this incredible painting entitled Cafe. But look at it and see who he has been talking to visually and conceptually. I mean, Blue Period Picasso is probably the moment of Picasso that it becomes very appealing to so many people. Because Blue Period Picasso is the moment when Picasso was really grappling with the challenges and the ravages of poverty and the difficulties of lives in Paris and also in Madrid and Barcelona. And so looking at this work on the left, the Frugal Meal from 1904, yes, William H. Johnson saw it, but look what William H. Johnson has done to the frugal repast, so the frugal meal. Instead, we are in Harlem, and we're in a cafe, and we have this incredible woman in her profile and her hat, right on top of her head, echoing the bowler hat on the man. And then the gentleman sitting at the table is echoing the woman from the Frugal Meal. But he is a cool brother with a zoot suit and his arms folded and his legs crossed. And then we've got these wonderful legs, the legs of the table, the legs of the chairs. My mother, when I showed my mother this painting, she said, "Oh, I know this painting." I said, "What do you mean?" My mother's 101 years old, and she's from Mullins, South Carolina. And she grew up in South Carolina. She says, "I know this." I said, "What do you mean, Mama?" And she said, "Look at that woman's legs." She said, in that era, black women could not buy hosiery that matched black skin. So look at her brown face and look at her pink legs. That's what black women had to deal with for a very, 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 very long time. So these works by these artists, they take cubism, they take these abstract tools and devices, and then they tell stories that are so relevant to the lives and the experiences of real people. Bearden. I was telling Diedra that my love, I like all of Bearden's. His career is just an extraordinary career. But there was something about those works from the early 1940s when he's kind of coming into his own as a maker. And these are works that kind of pull on a lot of the ideas that we've been looking at already. But also dealing with the politics and the economics and the social realities of life, just prior to World War II. Works like The Rites of Spring, where bodies and figures, there's distortion there, but it's distortion for a reason. It's not just distortion for the sake of breaking and taking things apart and putting them back together. It's a distortion that speaks to a human, emotional, psychological state of being. Or After Church, 1941, powerful, poetic work that I was in conversation of some weeks ago, a couple of months ago, with Glenda Gilmore about her new book that deals with Bearden. And we were talking about Charlotte and Bearden's memories of the lives that black people led during that time period, and how he's able to capture and encapsulate faces and feelings, again, through this cubist impulse. Moving forward, the one on the left is, again, another all-time favorite, The Family. These blue men, these blue women, these blue children. That's 1941. Flash forward to 1948, The Family, a piece in the collection at Duke University, our National Museum. Bearden has encapsulated these ideas. One of the things that I think really makes him so memorable and important for us is that, like Picasso, he absorbs and he takes everything that he sees and he puts it in a blender and then he represents it in a way that is quite extraordinary, as we can see here. And so I just want to finish my little spiel to you today and say that we've looked at Aaron Douglas, we've looked at William H. Johnson, we've looked at Lois Mailou Jones, we've looked at Pablo Picasso, and we have Romare Bearden again to thank for giving us an opportunity to kind of take in this history of African American art, this history of Black modernism, and to find a way to tell a story that frankly isn't in the Jansen history of art. It's not in the major books that have been written about Cubism and modernism. It's another story. It's another story where African American artists and African American culture and African American aesthetic sensibilities shape and really make a difference for how we see and understand what we're looking at. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back in the vicinity of Gastonia, where I grew up, and to be back at the Mint Museum, which I came to on many occasions for decades with my mother and occasionally with other family members who she dragged to come and see that 1980 show about Romare Bearden and so forth. And I have to say, I'm really amazed to find myself standing here today on the same podium or coming after Rick Powell. I mean, let's have some correction here. Rick is one of the foremost experts on Bearden in the world. I would like to think that I'm a foremost student of Bearden. I am still very much, very actively thinking about Bearden in the context of Cubism and Picasso, which this show and these events are taking on. But in my role as a curator, thinking about Bearden and modernism more broadly as well. What are the aesthetic influences, some or many of which at their foundation are Cubist inflected. But then there are other veins of modernism that Bearden is pulling in. And then he's blending them to render these representations of the culture that can broadly be described as African American, and thinking about how to locate, how to situate those images and that culture within the lineage of art history that has to date been so almost exclusively defined by the Picassos, the Matisses of the world, even as works of comparable formal achievement as well as thematic power are being made by Bearden and other artists. So it's with that framework that I come to you today to hopefully share some images that we can discuss later on. Diedra pointed out that this is March's Women's History Month, and that is the reason, by the way, that I am following Rick rather than introducing him. And I'm going to take that occasion to take a look not just at Bearden as a consolidator of various strands of influence and exchange and affinity, but looking at Bearden as an icon himself for current generations of artists, including women artists of color, who in their work of today are looking at Bearden in the same way that Bearden was looking at Picasso and Matisse. So we'll end with that. Oh, I'm sorry. So this, thinking about strands of influence and the whole idea of collage, and this idea of Bearden choosing collage as his formal medium, as an emergence, as a way to address his quest for a pictorial style and making materials that represented his worldview. He sought to portray a hybrid African-American culture that draws on material, on myriad sources and influences. The notion of a hybrid identity situated African-American culture within the context of the Black Atlantic, as defined by Paul Gilroy, and included exchanges between Africa, the Americas, Europe, the Caribbean. And it was rooted in a shift in art-making process that began with this idea. There were several strands, but I think the ones that were most powerfully influential for Bearden was this idea of initially papier-collé, pasted papers, papers that are plastered together, as a substitute for the traditional means of making a two-dimensional image intended to hang on a wall, which was oil on canvas. And so we see with this, anybody who takes an art history course will definitely see what used to be called a glass and a bottle of Suze, now titled namely for the main object that's visible here. But taking something that would typically be treated as a still life by a Cézanne, oil on canvas, and taking this scene of everyday life and thinking about how to use the materials, the material culture of everyday life, to render this scene in a way that used inexpensive, even fugitive materials. Newsprint was the major, one of the major materials that he worked with at this time. Newspapers that are visible, legible even in some cases, in this composition and others of the period, to shape, cut, tear, paste, and arrange in a way that doesn't render or depict a specific scene, but evokes it. So Picasso and his partner Braque in Paris are making these representations of everyday Parisian life in ostensibly an individual seated at a cafe table with a bottle of Suze on the table. While decades later, Romare Bearden is evoking the newsprint, the newspaper, as a means of capturing his reality of everyday life, a street scene in Harlem, the diverse populations who may be rushing for the subway, rushing for work. Some of them are reading a newspaper. I think his very sort of apt reference to the sources that he's pulling from in composing this image, like Picasso, by cutting and pasting paper. And photographs, a medium that became much more important by the 1960s than it had been for Picasso in the early part of the century. But this idea of using these materials to render scenes of life in his own lived experience in a manner that can be shown in juxtaposition with these earlier iconic works and take on iconicity of their own. African aesthetics. Picasso, so well known for bringing together avant-garde pictorial strategies of European painting, pictorial flatness, the non-naturalistic approach to the rendering of the figure, and evoking these masks and sculptures that he saw at the time in curio shops to help him think formally through how to achieve, how to intensify, how to amplify these projects of European flatness and fragmentation of the figure. So here we see this cubistic rendering of a fetish, possibly done. I'm not the expert of African sculpture to really identify this for you. But what we also see here is the rendering of this fetish in a way that calls us to think about not just the formal, the physical process of art making, but the spirituality, the intellectual, that indefinable quality that informs artistic inspiration and expressiveness and motivates artists to produce this work. Picasso was looking at this material in terms that have been described as primitivist. That is, he's making assumptions about a culture that he himself never visited, but just pulling from the formal qualities of the output, what's visible, what's present in his own society from these cultures, ideas that he has been working with in the context of European culture. So these were exotic influences for him. And thus this notion of the primitivist gaze, looking at cultures in the context of one's own culture. Picasso wasn't the only, and the Cubists of Europe weren't the only artists during this period who were looking at African aesthetics, as Rick pointed out. By 1980, and I'm sorry, I may have this middle work here is a sculpture by Sargent Johnson called Mask, and it was made in 1933. Sargent Johnson was the West Coast branch of the Harlem Renaissance, the new Negro artists. And they were responding to the exhortation by Alain Locke, the founding philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance, to evoke African aesthetics not as an exotic influence, but as an ancestral legacy. So he's using the materials of fine art, copper, bronze, working with wood, to convey a dignity to this rendering of an aesthetic that he is then claiming in making work that would be representative of things that he's observing, individuals that he's observing in his life on the West Coast in the 1920s and 30s. Bearden is blending those traditions. In Two Women, you see the bottom part here of this fetish that he is evoking, sort of the idea of magic, the idea of supernatural powers, but using that, as well as the mask aesthetic, the particular rendering of the face, of the nose, of the mouth, to show an everyday scene, a woman at dinner in probably an American setting with what looks like a bowl of ice cream with cherries on top. So this kind of portrayal of everyday life in the vocabulary of the international avant-garde is part of how Bearden brings these images into what has historically been called the canon, the type of thing the type of work that could be displayed beside a Picasso papier collage in papier collé in a museum setting like the Met or the Pompidou or the Musée Picasso and so forth. And one thing that I also found striking about Bearden was his interest, his continuing interest in the family and community figures, personae, situations, scenes that he observed, not just in New York City, where he moved with his family, I believe, from the age of 5, but looking back at figures, at lifestyles, at ways of being that he knew about from having family here in Charlotte and spending time in Mecklenburg County. So Conjure Woman, again, the mask aesthetic of the African fetish, but also evoking the fact that this person, someone in this position, would have been understood in the context of a Southern, primarily rural culture, to have the type of magical powers that the fetishes of African art were supposed to evoke. So maybe with more sort of considered engagement with the African aesthetic, I think this is one thing that characterizes the African American artists of the period and subsequently, that escapes primitivism and instead seeks to pull these ideas, these formal ideas, into the lineage of visual culture, of art history. And I think one of those ideas is the idea of black, everyday black life can be as universal as similar scenes that are so much better known because of the focus on the artist who made them. So we have Picasso's 3 musicians, an iconic work by Picasso in the Museum of Modern Art. And we have a piece that is in your collection here on view in your show right now, Back Porch Serenade. What does it take? What does it take for art history, for the viewing public to see these 3 guys sitting on a porch somewhere, probably not that far from here, as part of a universal reality? Every community has the trios, quintets, quartets, folks who are not necessarily formally trained, and the Harlequin attire of one of Picasso's musicians indicates these are just a bunch of guys who are getting together and playing music. Same thing, Back Porch Serenade. Why not look at these in juxtaposition? Why not think of the Back Porch Serenade not just as specific to a given culture, that of the African American rural South, but as an image that can evoke a universal reality that exists in all cultures, as the Picasso work has been positioned. So one of the things that I found interesting in looking at at Bearden, is the way that he toggles or moves between different sources of influence, often when working with a similar imagery. So here we see his 2 examples from a series of work that he began making in the late 1960s and made in some quantity through the 1970s. Patchwork Quilt, the first version of a different painting by the same name, now in MoMA. Still pulling on cubism, the faceting of the figure, the breakdown of bodily contours by geometric shaping, by sharp contrast in tonalities, not just of the figure, but aspects of the interior in which she's placed. But Black Venus, made just around the same time, begins to pull on another aesthetic, that of the silhouette, which was part of a vein of European modernism, practiced probably most extensively, not by Picasso, but by the fellow co-founder. If you think of the School of Paris, the two leading artists of that period are generally considered to be Picasso and Henri Matisse. So this Black figure, this silhouette, this way of rendering pictorial flatness and non-specificity, moving away from portraiture to indicate a condition, a general condition, the icon as a repository of formal ideas and cultural values rather than the representation of a specific individual. So this engagement with silhouette became a way in which Bearden broadens the formal and connotational tools that he then deployed in the extensive picture making of the period. One of the sources of this silhouette was likely Matisse. Bearden was a known admirer of Matisse. He wrote about the time in 1950 when he spent 5 months in Paris, and he used part of that time. He didn't make a lot of work himself in Paris, but he read the journal of predecessor artists, Delacroix of the early to mid 19th century, who talked about how engaging and how informative and how much it had shaped him as an artist to systematically make copies of precedent artists that he admired. And Bearden talked about doing this during his time there, and specifically noted that when he was making copies of works by Manet and by Matisse, he attempted to reproduce the exact color tonalities. So we see this here. Icarus is from Matisse's illustrated book, which was titled Jazz, even though it didn't have any necessarily specific connotations or relationship to jazz, but just the idea of improvisation, of pictorial informality, of openness, an open palette to make of a composition what the artist wanted, and the freedom that of expression that gave to an artist. So Matisse's Icarus, in comparison with a series that Bearden made based on his visits, I believe, with his wife to Martinique. And as he attempts to convey these scenes by the sea that engage the water, the mountains, the natural landscape of Martinique, he uses that kind of, the color palette of freedom of expression in this scene that, to me, is reminiscent of Matisse's own paintings of scenes by the Mediterranean Sea, luxe, calm, volupté, which is a sense of tranquility, a oneness with nature. So, working here primarily in this form of the silhouette to simplify but still capture the expressive qualities of the body. And I always want to point out that these types of influences went both ways, just as Bearden is looking at Matisse, looking at Picasso. Matisse is looking at African culture, African aesthetics, which we know, but in this case, rendering one of his silhouettes as a representation that he titled Negro Boxer. Matisse, unlike Picasso, actually did travel in the Americas. He spent time in New York while he was making the dancer murals at the Barnes Foundation outside Philadelphia. And we know from letters to his wife that during that time, he regularly visited Harlem. He attended theater. He went to jazz clubs. He swapped notes with his son, Pierre, about the collection of jazz recordings that he was building and that still exists today. So this Negro boxer, could it be a representation of what Matisse might have known about Joe Louis? Or could it be one of the several Latin American boxers of African descent who were prominent in Europe at the time? But the idea of us looking at them, they're looking at us. And again, silhouettes. Matisse did them beginning in the 40s and 50s, but the new Negro artist of the Harlem Renaissance, where we're talking about Lois Mailou Jones here, we see her in 1932. We see Aaron Douglas in 1936, using this simplified form of rendering the body to prioritize and give priority to the ideas, the aspirations, the social and cultural legacy that they are using these images to highlight. And I think one of the ways that Bearden brings together these different strands of influence is in this seminal painting, Patchwork Quilt, which he made in 1970, now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, when he is evoking African mask aesthetics, the Egyptian striding figure, even though he is placing that figural style in a prone, a reclining position, as opposed to the standing stride. But also the patchwork quilt. This is not just a collage of paper. This is a collage of fabric. If there would be a material that is more outside the sense of what the materials of fine art making would be, it would be fabric. This was women's work. This was women's material. And here we have Bearden evoking it to make a very powerful rendering of a black female reclining nude. Now, this also fits into a legacy of the reclining nude that black artists have had to aggressively intervene with for over 100 years. The most famous, arguably, reclining nude is Manet's Olympia. And we see here that the nude is white. The maid is black, posed by a model that we now know was named Laura. That was the formula for representations of beauty, of desirability, for centuries, going back to the Renaissance. And part of what enhanced that beauty, that desirability, was the representation of a black woman in a subordinate and often exoticized position. And that was the way that we saw the black female figure in this pictorial style. Now, Manet is arguably modernizing this to some extent by bringing Laura into the working class of post-abolition Paris and doing certain other formal things that present her in some ways more as a partner to the reclining courtesan. But still, she's the maid. And it was the new Negro artists of the Harlem Renaissance who began to disrupt that legacy, even though they're working in the same pictorial trope, the same position, the left to the right to left pose, head propped on elbow. William H. Johnson, the artist that Rick so evocatively spoke about, was one of the first. This nude that some see as exaggerated, possibly satirized. Larry Sims has written about the influences of German expressionism, but we also see this Cézannean still life, and we see her. We see the Black female body placed in this historical trope of the reclining nude. This figure, though, is still in a position where what is alluring about her is her nudity, her sexual attributes. It was Bearden with Patchwork Quilt who veered even further than Johnson, placing the Black female body in this trope. But her attributes are not overtly sexual. They are cultural. It's the representation of a value system that venerates the ancestral legacy of Egypt and Africa, but also admires, respects, and integrates into one's sense of self the folk traditions of African American culture, the patchwork quilt. So these are the ways that Bearden illuminates and revises art history. Now I'm going to show just a couple more images here to again emphasize that these cultural exchanges went both ways. If Bearden was looking at Manet, and Manet in turn looking at Titian, Matisse in one of the most monumental of his paper cutout paintings in the 50s, toward the end of his life, is depicting Katherine Dunham, the African-American dancer and choreographer, who had a major career in Paris at the time. And just looking at the formal composition here and looking at photographs of, looking at images of her posters, of her in performance, the gestures of performance, the pose, the positioning, and so forth, you can see what he's pulling on to make this. Likewise, Josephine Baker. This La Negresse is a wall-scaled cut paper by Matisse that is at the National Gallery. And again, the affinities with observed experience. So thinking about how all this comes together, Patchwork Quilt was a representation of this in the depiction of an individual. But I think that ultimately one of the most powerful kind of set of images in which Bearden is integrating all of these influences is his 1970, the monumentally scaled series of collages, 5 different panels called The Block. And I'm privileged that that is in the collection of the Met, and we're working with it and thinking about bringing it out again as a coda to the Harlem Renaissance show that Rick mentioned. But I just, again, call attention to the way that even as Bearden steps back and engages with representations of the community, the city street, a city streetscape, he's still attentive to the individual. So we see again in a painting spring way that is here in the Met, the Black silhouetted figure over on the right. And Bearden has placed a similar figure in Black silhouette at the top of a staircase in one of the panels of The Block. So this idea of solitude in the midst of the hustle and bustle of the city. And that is amplified as we look at the other panels and we get the glimpse into the windows of each of these 5 brownstones depicted here. And we see scenes of family life, we see lovers, possibly illicit, we see street processionals, funerals, the church, the liquor store. We see all of these components both as part of community, but also in their individuality. And we see the way that in some cases he's using the aesthetics of the cut paper, collage, cubism, And in others, he's using the simplified silhouette of the black figure silhouette. Just showing you a couple more panels here. Before I now turn, I'm going to go really fast through this because we've got to get on. Just thinking about the way that artists who are living and working today are integrating this legacy. And one obvious place to start is Faith Ringgold. Her series of paintings, the quilt paintings, the French collection. She's picking up on Bearden. She specifically said that. Patchwork quilt. She's making paintings from quilts, not just evoking them through collage. But she's also looking back at Matisse and the stained glass of a chapel in the south of France that he designed, as well as Picasso in his studio, working with the imaginary black model that she places there. She puts Josephine Baker in the position of a Matisse odalisque. Kara Walker, black figure silhouette, evoking the history of enslavement, abolition. And Rashi Johnson, taking stone, the making materials of mosaic, and placing those in the same formal structures as patchwork quilt, as collage, as assemblage that he observed looking back. Stanley Whitney, it doesn't always have to be about the black body. Abstractions based on Matisse's chapel. And finally, looking at Nicolene Thomas here, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, based on a Matisse painting, using, as she explicitly describes, the techniques of collage. Her materials are rhinestones as opposed to paper. And I think just ending here with a comment that Lorraine O'Grady has made in association with this painting, that as we bring art history into the present and think about how to broaden the narratives to be inclusive of this material, we have to think about the black woman, the black artist, as having the same space at the table to make representations of their own cultural specificity, and to have those representations be considered as universal. So thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Rick, for those two wonderful, wonderful talks. Don't get out of your seat. All those people who are leaving, get back in your seat. We're going to have about 15 minutes where we can have a discussion before we open up to the jazz reception. So if I can have Rick and Denise come up to the stage, and also Jonathan join us. We'll just do a little integration of the various talks.
Thank you so much, Denise, for a really eye-opening meditation on Bearden. And what struck me was collaging with paper, collaging with photographs, collaging with fabric, and then when we moved into the contemporary moment with people like Nicolene Thomas and Rashi Johnson, I'm just wondering, there's something happening here with collage that is not the collage of Hannah Hawk and an earlier moment. And Bearden in some ways is ushering in something that makes us rethink how materials can be put together in a delightfully dissonant way.
Yeah, I think he is. I'm sorry, is my mic on? Can you guys hear me?
Test it. It should put it up. See.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I think he is, and it's interesting when you think about patchwork quilt, and he introduces fabric into the making of his collages. And that can be considered to be kind of a gendered gesture because he's bringing the materials of what has historically been marginalized as women's work into this trope of fine art. Even though Bearden was deeply engaged with pornography and so forth. But I think that was a precedent for the women artists of subsequent generations. I mean, Faith Ringgold has said she got the idea of making quilt paintings from looking at, among many other things, patchwork quilt. And so, and then you go on to subsequent generations right up to the current moment. So I do think, as I was saying earlier, we spend a lot of time looking at Bearden or thinking about how Bearden is bringing in these anterior influences, Picasso, Matisse, Manet, African tribal aesthetics. But I think Bearden has taken on that type of generative, iconic stature in his own right. All of these artists have written about, they will name Matisse, Picasso, but they will name Romare Bearden as well, including women artists. So that is a turning point, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just add, when you think about the artists who go on and do assemblage, I mean, African American artists, completely enmeshed in those, kind of bringing in other objects and things later on.
Mark Bradford, for example,
yeah.
who it's got rope and paper and but it's on a different scale. Suddenly, it's almost half the size of this room.
Right. Can I put a question to Rick? Because I think you were very evocative in your presentation of Bearden's engagement with jazz and the Harlem Renaissance and the European modernist engagement with jazz. Thinking about how to curate galleries of that period, a Harlem Renaissance gallery, a School of Paris gallery, to what extent do we need sound to be present as well as visual art to really capture? Is that a distraction or an amplification and enrichment?
It might be both. And I'm going to lean on Diedra to help me answer that question, since both she and I have been engaged with jazz study at Columbia for a number of years, and these issues of thinking about the aural and the musical, not only in its own right, but in conversation with other art forms, such as literature, such as the visual arts, such as dance. And so your question is how to do it in a presentational way that works. And I think that what's so great about being on the planet in 2023 is that there's so many technologies now and so many opportunities and vehicles and tools for presenting multimedia arts in a way that on one hand will hopefully tell the story that you want to tell, but hopefully in such a way that one doesn't overpower the other. And while I don't have necessarily the answers on the tip of my tongue, I can certainly say that what's really great now is that if people collaborate and people think about not just the historical connections, let's say, of like 1929 and what musicians were performing and what artworks were being made during that time period and where those performers were doing their thing, whether it's New York or Paris. So we have that art, we have that historical dimension, but then we can think about how 21st century technologies can help us to tell that story in a coherent way, because by nature the multimedia can sometimes be discombobulating, but there's a way.
Yeah, I mean, just think about the block when it was initially presented in 1971. It had some kind of sound that was added to it that was supposed to be evoking the sounds of the street and gospel music, and to go along with this visual. And it wasn't something that Bearden had developed himself. We find through research that it was something the museum hired someone to do. And I think for that one presentation, we don't know yet because we're still doing research, but I think that it wasn't something that Bearden liked, or maybe the effect of it was not what he liked. Although he was, I like to say, an early mixed media painter, not just in materials, but also when you look at something like the profile show, where you have the visual and then he draws on the wall, the gallery wall, these little vignettes of things that go with the painting sometimes, but sometimes it's just to invoke a memory. And so that's kind of like an early mixed media.
And his collaborations with choreographers and musicians. And I'm thinking back to collaborations with the Marsalises, with Martin Puryear, with dance companies. I think he understood that there was a way to marry the art forms, and there wouldn't be competition. It would be complementary.
Jonathan, did you? I was going to say, do you have any questions? Yeah, why don't we put that out to anybody in the audience who has a pressing question? Because we're all thirsty and we want to get to the reception, right? Yes, sir.
I'll try to project.
I can repeat.
Okay. First of all, and I'm asking you to project, how do you think Bearden would interpret times that we're in now and the directions that we're going in? And then if you're considering music for the upcoming Renaissance, I vote yes.
Did everybody hear that? No. So one of them was, how do we think Bearden would respond now to the times that we're in? And the second one was, he votes yes for including music in future projects.
Great, thank you.
That's a tough question because I always think about Romare Bearden as a hands-on analog artist, meaning that he enjoyed making, and we have all those great photographs of him in the studio, at a table, paper cut up, and glue and rollers. On the other hand, we have to also remember that in the mid-1960s, he discovers Xeroxing and reproductions that he can make photographs of photographs and make copies of them in a multiple way. So in a 21st century new technology context, he might be really engaged with digital kind of image making, the computer. We can even look at people like David Hockney, for example, who's a different artist, but in some ways he has a parallel in the sense that he was also a hands-on artist, and now he is totally into playing with software and creating artworks using technology. So maybe Bearden would be doing that.
And I think whether he was doing it or not, because he would be a venerated elder if he were still with us today, he would certainly be urging the current generation of artists to do what he did, which is use the art-making materials and the technologies that were of his moment. Just as Picasso was working with newsprint and printed media, Bearden evoked that, but he was working in his collages to a large extent with, there were photo montages, there were montages of photographs. And so he would be really interested in seeing what somebody who's grown up, having access to the internet and creating on the internet would make. And I think he would say, figure out how to represent the music culture of the present day in the same way that we were engaged with jazz and with blues before those music styles became part of the mainstream. So I think he would say, be of your own time, but keep an eye on history as well.
I think he would say to open your minds and your mouths. You know, has a famous quote about the artist being like a whale, swimming and collecting and absorbing, because he was the great absorber of ideas and culture and music and everything. He grew up in Harlem, you know, right around the corner from the Lafayette Club. I mean, he was watching everybody come in and out. And, you know, I think that had a great influence on him, because later he's able to talk about all of these childhood memories in his studio on Canal Street. I mean, he's, you know, in the 70s, that's what he goes back to. And part of it is trying to capture a life in which he felt was disappearing. So yes, he would be telling young people, figure out what is going on and how to represent it before it disappears. You know, take ownership of it, find a form for it, and yes, steal some of it from other artists and then make it your own, which is something he said. So I just want to say one question that I thought was going back and forth between your presentations, and that's about the Black body in motion and movement and modern, how modern it was and seen. And that's an influx of music and everything that was going on at that time, but how it really represented something of, you know, something very forward, something very futuristic at that time.
Well, when you bring up the body in motion, I have to invoke Nanette Rohan Bearden as someone who enters Romy's life, and it's interesting that she enters his life at that moment that he is beginning to rethink and reimagine his own work. He's an AbX painter in the 50s, but by the mid-60s, he's thinking about this simultaneity through collage. And while it's not a direct link to the dance, the body in motion in terms of dance, it's a two-dimensional way of reconciling movement and the collapse of time. And so I think that his interactions with the dance world via Nanette, I think, was important and helps us think about him in relationship to corporeality.
I think about artists whose work is about, you know, sound and motion, artists like Nick Cave and the sound suits, and taking over Grand Central Station. He has a stationary exhibition at the Guggenheim right now, but the performative aspect of that. And I think it's a compelling part. It's a way to use the technologies of the time, but the composition, the making, the visual appearance of those suits are definitely hearkening back to, you know, African masking rituals and street life, you know, breakdance and all of these tropes of international Black culture.
When you think of the era in which Bearden grew up, it's the era of film becoming more and more prevalent, television emerging, so you're literally seeing bodies in motion all around you.
And Diedra, aren't there these incredible series of works that Romy did, costumes for ballets, and when you think about them, they're proto Nick Cave because they are pretty fantastic. Yeah.
That's true. Sheila can tell you about one of the, there's one ballet that he was developing where they were putting where they were just putting on trash, or were they putting on just different, he was collecting, what the idea of the dance was to collect all of this baggage and costuming and to make a dance of that. So the drawings for that are incredible. You know, they're actually little collages and drawings. Do we have another question? One more. Two? Okay.
Thank you. I was very interested in the storytelling aspect of what all of you were saying, and especially with its connection to jazz. And jazz is America's original art form, is known and revered more so outside the United States than it is here. So I was wondering, are you going to use any of his compositions and oral histories or his relationship to jazz to tell
Jazz, the ultimate modern music.
Well, I was just going to delightfully problematize what you brought up, because jazz is such an important part of African American culture, but we have to remember music is abstract. I mean, unless it has words to it and a story to it, it's something that you have to listen to and you have to feel and you have to kind of go with the flow. So it's non-narrative, you know, and that's what makes jazz so and black music so wonderful, that it's kind of the proto-African American abstract art form that Romare picks up on and finds ways of incorporating, you know, into his work, yet also adding a narrative dimension through the storytelling of the subjects, the landscapes, the figures, their interrelationship with one another. So jazz is both delightful and a challenge in terms of people being encouraged, audiences being encouraged to use their minds and imaginations to get into it.
I think Patrick had one question. Yeah.
Just a quick question. I mean, the more I learn about Bearden and the extraordinary career and work that he produced, I just always wonder, how did he make time for these publications that he wrote? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
The question is, with everything Bearden was doing and how prolific he was, how did he also make time for the books and publications that he produced?
Well, they took a long time. You know, when I was doing a talk on the book, the African American history from 1792 to the present, that he worked on with Harry Henderson, they talked about how that took 20 years. 20 years of conversation and friendship to get to that point, and it still wasn't done when Romare died, and Harry went on to publish it in 1993. So it took a long time, but it was part of the art. I mean, I do want to say with the Romare Bearden Foundation, a little plug, is that we perpetuate both the intellectual and the artistic legacies. And there's a lot. He was writing articles. The Painter's Mind, you know, that took a very long time, and it takes a long time to read because it's very dense. And so, yeah, it just took a long time. He also wrote music. I mean, it was all a part of the work. You know, wrote music, wrote poetry, watched sports, you know, big baseball fan, and walked around Harlem a lot and absorbed. So it was all part of the work, I think.
That's a great way to end it. And with the plug to books, I will say, please go out, enjoy the jazz, enjoy the friendship and conversations, but on your way out, make sure you stop by our shop down in the street level because we have books by both of these authors down there.
Thank you,
to learn more.
Dr. Denise Murrell, Dr. Richard Powell, thank you for joining us today. Jonathan.